Hi, everyone. Welcome to the And God Said podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Kimberly Constant, and this is a podcast I offer in conjunction with a Bible study I teach that covers every single book of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. We read and study each one. And so if you're interested, you can visit my website, kimberlyconstantministries.com, and there's some sign up information, more info about the study as well. You can sign up to join one of my discussion groups, or you can just be on the newsletter, in which I send out weekly reading plans, discussion questions to form your own small group or just for your own reflection, and just some other odds and ends to help keep you connected to the study. But you're also welcome just to be here for the podcast. I'm happy to have you in whatever capacity you find yourself here. And in this next set of lectures, we're going to look at the book of Psalms. This is a unique book, so it won't look quite the same as some of the other book studies that we've been doing so far. But this lecture is going to set the scene for us and to kind of help you get situated before you start your reading or studying. And it's called How Long? Setting the Scene for the Book of Psalms. So if we're looking at the chronological order of the books when they were written, Psalms here on this chart that I have, if you can see the PDF, if you're just listening to the podcast, you can Google chronological order of biblical books or chronological order of the Old Testament and pull up a similar chart. But they here have Psalms attributed kind of in the David time frame. A lot of Psalms were written by David, but they also kind of stretch through all of Israel's history. There's one Psalm that's attributed to Moses. There's Psalms that are attributed to the time after exile. So really, we're kind of covering everything we've already covered in terms of the historical books that we've read. Authorship and dating, as I alluded to just now, these Psalms have been written by many different people. It's basically a library within a library. And in this instance, it's a library of poetry. So lots of different authors over a wide span of history, as I said, some attributed to Moses, some attributed to post-exilic life. And at the original time of composition, the authors weren't necessarily noted. So when you read through the Psalms, you'll see headings under certain Psalms. Like, for instance, Psalm 3, underneath in italics, perhaps in your edition of the Bible, it might say something like a Psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. That information was something added later by a group of rabbis who were kind of consolidating and adding some helpful information. And so anytime you see a titled author, so Psalm 3 is attributed to David, that is something that was added later. But a lot of the Psalms still remain anonymous. In terms of the ones who are given authors' names, there's 73 attributed to David, 11 to the sons of Korah, those are worship leaders, 12 to Asaph, those are temple singers, so that makes sense, right? Our worship leaders today often write their own material as well. As I said, there's one attributed to Moses, that's Psalm 90. There's two attributed to Solomon, David's son, and those are Psalm 72 and 127. And then there's a few attributed to what were called the choir families, Herman the Ezrahite, Ethan the Ezrahite, and Jeduthun. And so you'll see those names as you're reading. Genre. Well, overarching genre is poetry. But poetry in and of itself takes on many different kinds of forms. So in these Psalms, you'll find some of the language of poetry. So for instance, especially in the Psalms, they use something called parallelism. And this is because the Psalms were meant to be sung. These are meant to be used in worship. We're extensively talking about a book of worship. And the congregations would sing them back and forth to each other. So there's repetition involved. And with this parallelism, sometimes it is, one for one. It's just restating. One line says something, the grass is green. The next line says the grass is lime, basically saying the same thing. Or sometimes there's like an antithetical parallelism where they might say something opposite, but they'll relate to each other in some way. Then you're going to find a lot of metaphors and similes. And when you do, you want to ask what is being compared and why. There's hyperbole, exaggeration, right? Personification, we've already seen that in the Old Testament, and you'll see it again here. For instance, wisdom often gets personified in the wisdom literature and in Psalms as well, or elements of nature sometimes, like the sea roared, the sea talked, the sky wept, that kind of language. There's a lot of Psalms that feature acrostics, so that's an alphabet, or sorry, that is a poem written in alphabet order. So in this case, the Hebrew alphabet. So for us, that's difficult to identify in translation because we're translating to whatever language we're reading in, more than likely not the ancient Hebrew that it was originally written in. So we can't pick up on that. So I will try to point that out in the Psalms that we study when it becomes applicable. But often they would use an acrostic to sort of add organization or add limits to themselves. It kind of is the challenge, right? I'm not just going to sing a song of worship to God, but I'm going to do it using the Hebrew alphabet and challenge myself in that way. And it also helps them to emphasize their words. And since this is poetry as a genre, we have to be very careful with our interpretation. This is not black and white. This is much different than we would read the legal code in Exodus. The genre of poetry is still portraying truthfulness, but in terms of emotion and mood rather than like do this, do that. So you want to pay attention to the mood invoked by the psalmist, and does that mood perhaps change as we're reading it? We want to look at the depth of the emotion, the poetic devices. They're trying to paint a vivid image of some sort of emotional truth, and they're expressing it as a form of worship to God. So again, very careful. Remember, there's things like hyperbole, personification present. So we're looking more at mood than we are at like literal one-for-one translations. The structure of the Psalter, there is a loose structure, even though each psalm stands alone on its own. Some of them are actually paired well together, and there are a few psalms where it seems like they were actually one big psalm and they kind of split them into two. There's a few things like that throughout the Psalter, but for the most part, they're very standalone. But they've been organized in such a way as to have kind of a loose structure, if you will. So the first two psalms, which we're going to talk about at the end of this lecture, form an introduction to the entirety of the book of Psalms. Then we have books 1 through 3, which generally trace the erosion of Israel's faith during the time of the monarchy. It's not perfect, but that's kind of the overarching shape that we're going to find. These books culminate with Psalm 89, which is a psalm that does indeed reflect on the devastation of the people being exiled from the land of Israel. So it's kind of getting us to that pinnacle moment of exile. And then books 4 through 5 are roughly a response to that. So if you can imagine like a downhill trajectory, and Psalm 89 is like the lowest of the low point, books 4 and 5 are generally leading us to a high point once more. And so they're the response to the sorrow of exile. And a lot of these focus on reflecting on the true king of Israel, not the human kings that failed Israel, but the true king, which is God. So the first psalm to begin this half of the Psalter is Psalm 90. That's the one that's attributed to Moses. And it's meant to kind of connect the people back to a time before the human kings, to connect the post-exilic Israelites to the original initial plan of God, and to a time when they relied on God alone. And the final 6 psalms of the Psalter, Psalms 145 through 150, are the conclusion, and they are all psalms of praise. So that's what I mean by we end on a really high note with the Psalter. They point to an ultimate victory for those who remain faithful in God. So there's a loose structure, and it's helpful. It's helpful to know that structure as you're examining a psalm to kind of see where it might fit into this overarching pattern. But we don't want to hold too tightly to it. It's loose. There are certainly some psalms that might seem out of place in that structure. There are several different types of psalms. So we have praise or hymn psalms. These are direct worship of God. It sounds just like it is what it sounds like, praising God based on who God is or his character. Then we have the laments. This is the majority of the psalms are laments. They can be the lament of an individual or a corporate lament on behalf of all of the people. And they are a petition or a prayer for help. Then we have Thanksgiving Psalms, which are sort of a combo of praise and lament because the lament is something that has happened in the past. So they are recounting a time when they did lament and then thanking God for answering whatever prayer was associated to that. Then we have a couple of Psalms or types of Psalms that focus on kingship, one on the human kings and one on God as king. So royal Psalms focus on the Israelite king, and as we'll see, some of these are very particular, like the psalm when a king gets married or the psalm when a king is being crowned for the first time. And then we have Adonai Malach Psalms, which that means in Hebrew, the Lord reigns. And these focus on God, on Adonai as Israel's true king. And so we're going to see these throughout the Psalter, but more concentrated in those final two books after the time of exile, when they once again were really looking at God as their king. Then you have Torah Psalms, that means law in Hebrew. And so these focus on instruction centered on the Word of God. And then finally, there's a few Psalms that are what we call historical Psalms. And so this offers a recitation of Israel's history and a way to connect the people to what has happened before. And if you're able to access the PDF from the newsletter that I send out, or if you're able to watch this instead of just listen to it on YouTube, you're able to watch the PowerPoint as I talk through it. I have listed what each psalm is. So I'm not going to read through all 150, but this is just kind of for your use as you read and study the Psalms. Just note that some of these, these are kind of my best estimation. And I took a class on Psalms, and so something we talked about in seminary. But some of these Psalms can maybe be more than one thing. It's debatable. We could have a discussion. But overall, here's what each Psalm is. And I've given them to you for all 150 Psalms. So the purpose of the Psalter, as I have been saying, these are worship poems, if you will. So in Hebrew, it means praises or songs of praise. And this was the book of worship for the Israelites. This was their hymnal. And we have a variety of hymns, all of which express this kind of multifaceted nature of human emotions, and all of it directed toward God as an act of worship. So, unlike the other biblical books, which contain God's word for the benefit of human beings, the Psalms contain humankind's words for the benefit of God. So, it is a very unique book. It is hard to study in a study like we're doing because we're going relatively fast and we're trying to kind of connect overarching themes. And certainly we can do that in the Psalter. What we're going to do is look at each genre. So every day of this week, we'll spend with a few Psalms from each genre and kind of talk through those and how they exemplify a lament or a Thanksgiving psalm or a psalm of praise, for instance. But it's really, we won't be able to read through all of them. What I can offer you is on my website, there is a tab called Praying Through the Psalms Devotional. And I did a devotional last year where each day we read and prayed through 2 of the Psalms because they are songs of praise, but they also are great prayers. And if you ever struggle with your prayer life or you're in a dry spell where you just don't have the words to offer, or you just want to kind of have something to lend shape to your prayer, the Psalter is a great tool for that. And they are really meant to be sung. They are meant to be prayed. They're not just meant to be read. They're meant to be spoken out loud. Again, very unique book. So you could definitely, that material is on my website. You can do it anytime. I have the lectures on there. They're just little 10 to 15 minute devotionals that you can listen to each day. And I close with prayer, praying through the Psalms with you. So if you're interested in more information about the Psalms and that kind of a format, that is on my website. So if you're in my class, I will include the link to the page in my newsletter. So understanding a psalm as you're studying, because if you might choose to read through more than what I have on the reading plan, or if you're just listening to the podcast and not part of the Bible study, then you might want to be looking at Psalms yourself. So here's some questions that you can ask as you're reading to help you interpret what the psalm is trying to tell us. So number one, where's the psalm located within that general narrative, within the general structure of the Psalter? Is it in the first half, kind of pre-exile, where Israel was very, much invested in the human king? Or is it in the last two books of the Psalter where they're starting to understand, like, what does it mean to be these people that don't have a nation anymore? Is God still our God? And yes, indeed, he is. And then more than that, he is our king. Second question, what type of psalm are you reading? Is it a praise? Is it a complaint, a thanksgiving, an Adonai Malach psalm? Again, that's where you can use the sheets I put in this presentation that show you which each psalm is. So that will help you as well. Then you can ask, what type of poetic devices does the author employ? What kind of metaphors? What similes? Is there personification? Does there seem to be hyperbole? What poetic tools is the author using? And how might these highlight his or her meaning? Question number, what are we on? 4. What mood or emotions are evoked by the psalm? Is the psalmist seem to be angry? Is the psalmist depressed, anxious or worried, scared? Is he happy and joyful? What is the mood? And does that mood shift? Because sometimes indeed it does. Or is it there a consistent tone? And then the final question you might ask is, how does this psalm help, or how does all these answers help me understand what the psalmist is trying to say? Does any of this kind of give me a way to interpret it? And then we want to look at applying the psalms. So once you kind of goes through those interpretive questions and settle in on what you think the psalmist might be trying to convey, then you want to ask yourself, so what is this? So what, right? What does this mean for me and my life? So you can ask, what do I learn about God? What do I learn about God's work in the world from this psalm? How does this psalm give me insight into my role in serving God, or even in worshiping God? And of course, my favorite way to use the Psalms is to pray through them. So I've included a couple of ideas for that, and I'm going to model that for you through our lectures this week. So you can substitute, just as you're praying, substitute me or us, or your own name, or names from your prayer list, where the psalmist says I or we. Just make it personal. So I'm just going to use Psalm 1. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked. I would say, blessed is my name, Kimberly. I do not walk in step with the wicked. You can personalize it. Or if you're praying for someone that you want to know God, perhaps, like you could put their name in. Or if it's for your children or your family members or friends or people in need, you can insert their names. You can also replace the psalmist's specific laments or joys or even, yes, curses with your own. So if the psalmist is lamenting living in a cave and running from enemies, maybe you aren't, physically in a cave hiding from your enemies, but maybe you feel hard pressed on all sides by whatever challenges are in your life, or maybe you feel like you're under spiritual attack. You can personalize that as you're praying the psalm. Also, we talked about mood, what mood is evoked by a psalm. So as you read and study, you might note sometimes, like, I love writing in the Bible. It's so helpful to have little notes for yourself. For instance, I've gone through in the Psalms and I wrote what type of psalm it is right next to the title. So Psalm 1, and then I have in my pen, it's a Torah or wisdom psalm. And then you can also write moods down. So if there's a psalm that seems like to really speak to someone that is going through depression, for instance, you might note that. And then that way, if you or someone you're praying for is going through a season of depression, you can go to that psalm and use those words to pray. If someone's angry, if someone is feeling spiritually attacked, if someone is celebrating something or thankful for something, all that. So you might just note 1 word or 2 words what the mood is of each psalm. You can listen to a song inspired by the psalm. That's another way, and like journal or take a walk as you listen to the song and kind of reflect on that. There's lots of songs written that are sung. The Psalms are just turned into a modern day song. You can find those. There's songs that have sort of taken inspiration from it. In the Bible study we're doing, one of the things I include in the newsletter is a link to my Spotify playlist. And I like to choose both secular and more sacred worship type songs for each book of the Bible, because it just kind of helps it bring it to life for me. I like being creative and trying to find a song that I think matches the mood and the theme of each biblical book. And you can do the same thing for the Psalms as well. I'm Kimberly Ann Constant on Spotify if you want to search me. And I think I still have my Psalms devotional playlist on there. So you're welcome to listen to that. But anyway, you can find your own songs that remind you of some of your favorites. And that's just another way to kind of internalize what we're reading. And then you can kind of follow a plan for yourself, like pray 1 psalm every day. Start with Psalm 1 and work your way through the book. There's 150, and then when you get to 150, you start over again. Or you can follow a different plan. In my devotional, we looked at 2 each day. And that kind of idea was you could pray 1 in the morning or 1 at night, or you could combine them into 1 prayer if you wanted. But whatever you do, challenge yourself to work your way through the entire Psalter, because it's going to challenge you to pray for things that you might not normally pray for. We kind of get in a rut sometimes in our prayer life, and we're asking the same things over and over again, and that's not bad. God wants all of our prayers. But there's so much more that we can be challenged to pray for, and the Psalter helps you kind of discipline yourself in prayer in that way. So let's look at the first 2 Psalms, since they do form really an introduction to the entire book. So Psalm 1, the author is unknown, well, for both of them. Psalm 1 is a Torah or wisdom psalm, and Psalm 2 is a royal, focused on the human king psalm. But they work together. They're really kind of a unit. And because they each begin, Psalm 1 begins and Psalm 2 ends with the word blessed. And that's from the NIV translation. But the better translation of the Hebrew word would actually be happy. So if we inserted that into the first verse of Psalm 1, it would say, happy is the one who does not walk, stand, or sit with the world, but who delights in the law of the Lord. Or for us, who walk, stand, and sit with Jesus Christ, for those of us who are Christians in these post-New Testament times. And then verse 12 of the second psalm would end with, happy are the people who take refuge in the Lord. So it provides a bookend to the in-between contents of those 2 psalms, and those provide an introduction to the Psalter. So let's look at Psalm 1. Sometimes this psalm is called the Psalm of 2 ways, because there is a contrast between what to do and what not to do, between the righteous and faithful person and between an unfaithful or wicked person. And the unfaithful person experiences a downward trajectory. So we see the description of this person. First, the Psalter is walking with the wicked, then standing with the sinners, and finally sitting with the mockers. So they're going from walking to standing to sitting. So downward trajectory. Meanwhile, the faithful or righteous person delights in the Lord, specifically his law. He meditates on it constantly, or she. So for us, we would think meditating constantly on Jesus. And that person moves forward, so experiences forward trajectory. They have strong, deep roots, they are in well-watered soil, and they yield fruit in season. So there's a comparison and contrast there. So in the end, the unfaithful or wicked person is blown away like chaff. Chaff is like the husks of the seed or corn or wheat that they would harvest. It was worthless. And they will not even be present in the place where God's people assemble. And the Psalter says, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, whereas the way of the wicked will perish. So our first psalm starts us off with a choice. Will we walk with the wicked or will we walk with the righteous? And clearly, the evidence is pointing towards choosing the path of righteousness because it's a much better outcome. Then Psalm 2 looks at the human king, and it was meant to give confidence to the newly crowned king. So this is a psalm that was probably read over each new king or the one queen they had at coronation. It begins with a prologue, which is a question: why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? And then there's sort of three acts. So there's the first act is the courts of earthly power, and this represents godless humanity, those who oppose the moral authority of God, and the rebellion of the human will. Then the second act is in the court of heaven, where God laughs at, scoffs, rebukes, and terrifies these conspirators. And then Act 3 is the court of the future king, the ideal king. And they use the words, "You are my son," the Lord says to the king. These were words that were used in the ancient Near East for an adoption ceremony. So they're using that same word here between God and the human king. So God is adopting the king, and the ideal king will then rule as God's son. Of course, we know the history of Israel's kings, and that did not happen very often, but that was the plan. And then in the epilogue, there is a warning to the people to humble themselves and accept the king and submit to God. Because if they didn't, destruction awaited. And if they did, well, the final verse says, happy is the one who takes refuge in the Lord. So the king, acting as God's adopted son, is their leadership, and they are meant to submit to the authority of the king. So that's what starts us off in the Psalter. So we're looking at choosing the right path, being humble, accepting authority, and submitting oneself to God. And then we're going to see how that translates into every other psalm that we will look at. So like I said, each day, if you're following along with the study, we're going to look at a different category. We're going to start with the laments, and then we're going to end with the Psalms of Praise. And we'll study a few psalms. So in your reading plan, I've given you several. I don't know if I'm going to talk through each one in the lectures, but in the PowerPoint presentation, I will have a slide for each psalm. So if you want information about it, you can just read what I've written. Like I said, I'm not sure how long it's going to take me, and I don't want to make these too long. So I might just pick one or two each day to focus on, and then let you read through the rest of the material. So a bit of a unique week, but hopefully a fun one, and it's going to shake things up a bit and give us some fresh breath of air after the difficult reading in the historical books. All right, enjoy your reading, and I'll see you for the next lecture where we start with the laments.